Thank you so much for having me here. I'm very glad to be back at Princeton. I should have added to that bio that I was very pleased to work for the Aquinas Institute here for 2 years. I'm glad to be back and seeing some of the students I met primarily on Zoom during the pandemic, and to return to campus just as the weather shifts from ice cream at the bent spoon to cocoa at the bent spoon. I'm really pleased to be here tonight to talk about how we address the difference between men and women and the different pressures we face to deny or cover up that difference. Because the important truth at the heart of the feminist movement, and the thing that I think appeals to people most, is the fact that women are often asked to navigate a world that's built with men in mind. And that can kind of vary in terms of what kinds of compromises or kinds of obstacles women find in their way. Some of them are the sort of trivial. A lot of tools are designed for male proportions rather than female proportions. I myself have been reluctant to get a new iPhone for years because they kept designing them so that they were possible to hold in a male hand, but often needed two to hold comfortably in a female hand. Women are often encouraged to moderate our own way of presenting ourselves in the world. The Sheryl Sandberg kind of lean in approach to presenting yourself, where typically female ways of interacting socially or speaking, ways of saying, excuse me, I think one thing I'd like to say, have to be kind of pared back and to fit into a more male model of leadership where apologies are weakness. And there wasn't room to say, well, is it possible that we should have a little more room for uncertainty when making decisions? No. What's important is that you learn to fake certainty and present yourself in exactly the same model of leadership as has been working for men. It's not just how women are asked to frame what they're saying. Sometimes it's our voices ourselves. It's common for tools or vocal recognition to be tested only with male voices in the sample, to the point where certain car manufacturers found that their audio systems for navigation didn't respond well to female voices because they'd never included them in the training data for the system. And when this was pointed out, they suggested that perhaps women could just manage the gap by lowering our voices to say, I need directions. And this is often the kind of solution women are invited into. If the world is made for men, then the solution is for women to do our best to make up for the fact we're kind of deficient men. But there isn't room for women to be women vibrantly and strongly. It's our job to make up for the fact we're not quite as large or quite as deep-voiced or quite as assertive or quite as whatever the world expects as the default. And it's our job to find a better way of counterfeiting what's always a very narrow version of masculinity to navigate the world. But there are some things that can't be counterfeited and some gaps that have a real cost for women and ultimately for men as well. It's one thing for women to be left out of the audio testing for car navigation systems. Another thing for women to, by default, be left out of many medical clinical trials. And that's for a variety of reasons. There's worry about exposing women who might become pregnant to drugs that could have an effect on a baby. But there's also just the concern that because of a woman's natural cycles, medicine might affect her differently at different points in the cycle. And you might think that sounds like a pretty good reason to include women in the clinical trials so you understand how a woman's natural fertility and any given medication interact. But in fact, usually the solution is to restrict the study to only men or only men and women on birth control, so that there isn't that kind of noise in the data you'd have to expand the sample size for. And as a result, we wind up with a medical industry that often prescribes doses that are too large to women since they're calibrated to a man's body mass, or interact with the hormonal cycle or with pregnancy itself in ways that weren't anticipated and weren't tested for because it was too complicated to fit into the study at the outset. Even in labor, women are often asked to change what we're doing to be more convenient to someone else. That the conventional position for labor is one designed to make things as easy as possible for the doctor so that he or she can sit comfortably with good lighting to deliver the baby while the woman lies on her back, a position that doesn't really align the baby with gravity or make her work easier to do, but is most simple for the professional in the room, who of course is not doing the actual work of labor himself, but it just wouldn't be reasonable for him to accommodate himself to her. A woman's job is to accommodate herself to a system that isn't built for her. So then the question is, how do we respond to this gap? If we have a world that treats men and women unequally because we apply too narrow a model, is the project of treating men and women as equal in dignity a project of helping women catch up to men, teaching them how to camouflage our voices, teaching us how to suppress our fertility, teaching us how to modify ourselves to fit more naturally into this narrow mold? Or is it a question of expanding what we're willing to accommodate so that there's room for men to be men and women to be women, with all the variation that's included within both, but without treating women as though we're an outlier, or particularly feminine traits as though they're fundamentally unwelcome in the world? Women and men are different, and admitting the fact of those differences doesn't compromise our claim to equal dignity. I think often people fear that it does, so even trivial differences are kind of papered over out of fear that conceding any difference at all is the end of a claim to real equality, or even an end of a claim to real relationship between the sexes. There are differences that are kind of stark and absolute. Men and women have different roles to play in reproduction. There's no real way around that, no matter what sleights of hands or sleights of language or proposed artificial wombs are posited. Men and women are different in a very stark way that has real consequences for how we lead our lives. There are differences that are stark but trivial, where it doesn't cost us anything to admit them, but it's still rarely discussed or admitted because admitting differences between the sexes feels dangerous. I think my favorite extremely trivial but extremely pronounced difference between men and women is simply a matter of grip strength. This is actually one of the easiest things to measure, and if you were desperate to find out the gender of someone you couldn't observe directly but could perform one surprisingly easy test on, it would be grip strength. Because you might think that there's kind of that model of overlapping bell curves, and this is the one that's true for height, right? You have men are on average taller than women with a bit of overlap in between. But grip strength is the one where the bell curves are like this, where in one study, 90% of women produced less force for grip than 95% of men. Even female athletes who were significantly stronger than other women corresponded to the 25th percentile of male grip strength. There are real differences that really cost me very little as a woman to admit. I don't ground my sense of dignity in my ability to open a jam jar. But when I kind of run into those differences, I do have to think about what are things calibrated to and what room is there for those variations. Even when there are kind of those overlapping bell curves of difference, whether it's degree of interest in particular subjects where we don't expect perfect parity as the just outcome, or height, where there isn't any actual moral valence to how tall you are. And I say this even though I am 1 inch taller than the average woman, but not 1 inch more worthy or dignified than the average woman. In height, we see what tends to be that overlapping bell curve model where the average man is taller than the average woman. And we can talk about a difference between the sexes without concluding anything worrisome about a difference in dignity, and without believing that means every man is taller than every woman, or that there's a problem when a particular man is shorter than a particular woman. We see this distinction without each individual compared to each other always falling on the side that the averages fall on. But even there we can see how gender plays a role. It's not shocking for a man to be 5'7", and it's not shocking for a woman to be 5'7". But we expect them to move through the world differently at that same height and have different reactions or pressures or problems related to it because of the fact of their gender. Most of these examples are kind of lower stakes. But ignoring the difference between gender actively asking us all to cover it up, asking us to be complicit in trying to minimize it, can cost lives. Women are more likely to die in car accidents for a variety of reasons. Crash test dummies are calibrated to men's heights and weights, so the ways we test cars for safety do a poorer job reflecting what protection women need than men. But here again, the car manufacturers kind of cast this as a problem of women letting the car down rather than the car failing to protect them. And there was one quote from a car manufacturer that just kind of really made it clear this wasn't his fault or his responsibility. Because what he said was, biologically, females are slightly weaker and women sitting closer to the steering wheel can be an issue. And that's an issue because our legs are shorter, so we can't reach the pedals at the same seat distance a man can, which puts you closer to the airbag and at greater risk in the event of a crash. He says there's a difference between men and women. I acknowledge that, and I acknowledge this may be hard for women to accept. But this is not an easy problem to solve. You could say the same thing about the elderly, because they're not average either. The aging population is also more vulnerable than average drivers due to weaker bones and lesser muscle tone. And that's where I think we hear the way that the narrowness of our society, our unwillingness to consider the difference of sex, doesn't just harm women. The more narrowly we define the average and the standard, the more people it turns out who are left out of it. It's not just women who are at greater risk in cars, it's everyone older, everyone whose fragility isn't reflected in the crash test dummy, everyone who isn't the median, 30-something man, and many of the median 30-something men aren't included either. A man who's shorter is already then in that position of being closer to the blast of the airbag. But the more we kind of say there's one standard, and our goal is to help raise everyone to that standard or help them fit that standard, taking a kind of Harrison Bergeron-like averaging out approach, the more and more people we find who are not median and who are left out completely. And I find it so striking what he says, the problem with women is, the problem he can't be expected to make room for, the problem women are expected to solve here. We're too vulnerable, and we're too close. Because in many ways, that's what I hear at the heart of the complaint, where we see the greatest pressure on women to act as though being a woman is a mistake in some way, a mistake that has to be fixed, that the masculine model is something that has to be caught up to. And again, that's the question of fertility, that women are too vulnerable and too close to a child. And the solution here is not accommodating women as women or making space for female fertility. It's finding a way for women who kind of are treated at the outset like deficient men to catch up and be slightly less deficient men. And that ranges from expectations of contraception, the suppression of natural fertility. What's framed almost as, it's often pitched as the restoration of something women should have been entitled to from the beginning. Men can't get pregnant, and women can, so that's obviously unfair. How do we fix that? How do we fix this weird deficiency in women where they have this capacity that's a problem for them and for everyone else? And then always following behind contraception is abortion as the backstop. Erica Bakioki, who's written a beautiful history of theories of feminism and of Wollstonecraft particularly, talks about this as that men are assumed to have the ability to walk away from a child. And a great deal of attempts to achieve equality for women are not framed around asking men to do more, asking men to truly be men and support children they father. It's about asking women to live down to this washed out expectation of men. So not only do we expect less of men, we expect women to descend to this kind of poor expectation. Say, how do we give women the freedom to behave badly, to walk away from someone who depends on them? Ruth Bader Ginsburg felt that the right to abortion should never have been defended under a right to privacy, but under an equal dignity under the law claim for women. What she kind of said was that abortion is the price of admission to society, that we have a society that's built economically, socially, et cetera, around the assumption that you never have to have someone depend on you if you don't want to, that any tie you have to someone else is optional. And biologically, that's more true for men than for women. Ethically, not so much, but biologically. And so for women to be able to hold jobs at the same rate as men, for women to be able to have the same options available, that could only be possible through abortion, because our society is built to be hostile to women and to be hostile to having someone who needs you. I think she's right in her analysis of what our society expects. I think she's right that our society frames abortion and contraception and children only on a schedule that works for you as the price of admission. Where we disagree is I think it's an unjust and brutal price. I think it's an unjust and brutal price for men as well, even though there isn't the same violence built into walking away from someone who depends on you. But we've built a society around a very narrow and empty, heartless model of masculinity, and expected both men and women to narrow themselves, to cut off anything that doesn't fit, to make a Procrustean bargain where any sense of someone else who needs you, any sense of a way you're extended that the world doesn't accommodate, it's your job to prune that. It's your job to fit better into the mold that we have that people fit most naturally into. It's an accommodation you can make maybe for some things, for finding a different tool that fits you better, for adjusting a seat to sit more comfortably, but it's not an accommodation you can make at the price of a life. But it's the accommodation we routinely expect women and men to make. And so what we have is that a world that is hostile to women, that is hostile to babies, is always a world that's simply hostile to vulnerability, to being too fragile and too close. It's a world that's hostile to a full and robust experience of masculinity as well, which is always tied in to care for the vulnerable, and not a world that expects vulnerability to be hidden, where a man can't respond to it or isn't expected to. And one of the things I found very moving is that we kind of frame this often around autonomy. Even in pro-life discourse, we sometimes justify the rights of a baby through an appeal to, well, how much can the baby do? Like, isn't the baby pretty close to being an independent person? And to be honest, some of those arguments are very moving and they're surprising too. They're worth bringing up just so people have an accurate idea of who a baby is. My daughter right now can do a number of things. She has a much more powerful right hook than I do, as far as I can tell from this side. She can perceive light and dark through my body. Light still reaches her and she can respond to it. She can hear voices, and when she's born, she'll recognize my voice and her father's because she'll have been hearing it the whole time. She can adjust herself to be comfortable, or if I'm trying to feel her kicking, decide she's not very interested in that and just turn over. And she frequently evades the Doppler at her checkups, I think just to amuse herself and annoy the midwife. But none of those abilities stacked up are what give her her dignity. And there's not a moment where she got just close enough to autonomous that she attained worth. I was counting down to around 20 weeks because I wanted to know when we'd have the best chance, if something happened that went wrong, of saving her life. But nothing happened for her that changed who she was as she kind of passed a mark of possible viability. And this is what I found so moving in a book on Being Human by O. Carter Snead, which is a book on medical ethics and law. And he made a very different claim about the dignity of a baby, the dignity of a woman, and the dignity of us all than I'm used to hearing. Because usually the argument anyone makes for my baby's dignity is that she's like me. She's like me, but a little smaller and a little weaker, but close enough to round up to being me. We both have fingernails. Congratulations to us both. And Snead says, the baby is different than me in some important ways, is much more radically dependent, can't really survive on her own. If she were delivered early, it could be helped, but genuinely needs me more than she needs a NICU bed. There's a real loss, even if a life can be saved in being delivered early, because she belongs with me. She belongs dependent on me at this stage. And Snead says, yes, the baby is like her mother because the mother is like a baby. And usually we view that comparison as insulting. To compare someone into a baby is infantilizing them, and it's usually not something you do and expect it to go well. But it's the truth. He says a pregnant woman is dependent. There are a lot of things that are harder for her. They're harder than they are for a father, even though they both love the baby. But a pregnant woman, is feeling sick, is feeling tired, literally needs more food, as I adjust to that myself, has different and more urgent needs than she does when she's not pregnant. And although I'm more viable, than my infant, I'm not very viable with no one around to support me or help me. None of us are. And so he says the baby has dignity because the baby is like her mother, and they're both people who can't survive on their own. That's what unites them. The baby has a just demand on her mother because she has need and is a person, and the mother is the one who is best suited to provide that. But I, as a mother, also have a just demand on the people around me who are the ones best suited to support me. So he doesn't frame it through the conventional lens of autonomy, this kind of narrow median person who needs nothing, asks nothing, already fits naturally in the world. He frames it as a tapestry of giving and receiving, of needing and helping, that unite mother and child through this extreme dependence and unite mother to father and mother to community through dependence that brings us together, not that we prepare ourselves to be alone and self-sufficient and only help each other out because we're friends, but we know it's embarrassing. We know it's kind of bad to need help, so we do it, but we avert our eyes. We do it, but we don't bring it up again, or we do it, but we carefully return the favor as soon as we can, because to be dependent is to be bad or wrong or babyish in some way. And Snead says no, to be dependent is to be human. It's at the heart of the Christian anthropological claim that we're not simply dependent on each other, we're dependent moment by moment to be conserved in existence by God. It's not a surprise to be dependent, and if it's shameful, there's no alternative to it. And you can hide from your friends, but you can't build a life built on hiding from God or being ashamed to know him. So instead, he says that our dignity comes from neediness and from answering that neediness in others where we can. But if that's at the heart of who men and women are, it's a truth that we're asked frequently to deny. Men as well as women, but women have a harder time pretending. I think men are also asked to pretend this frequently. To put a brave face on, to not ask for help, to not admit to the depth of a friendship, to treat things casually that they'd like to take seriously. Men are asked to not have parental leave in many cases because there's nothing for them physically to recover for, so why would they need to be with a child? Or as long as the mom can, have her mother come in, why would you need to be the one giving care? Why can't you just be at work? I think men have an easier time fitting this unjust demand. But it remains unjust, even if men manage to make these compromises some of the time or feel they have no choice but to make these compromises. But they fall more heavily on women and are often framed in a way where we cannot compromise ourselves to answer them. A woman who has just delivered a baby usually cannot physically return to work, no matter what her employer expects. And so we kind of face this false choice, this false model of the median offered to men and women, where men can fake it for a bit longer or more persuasively than women can. And then it feels like it's simply a problem for women. But it's a problem of denying what it means to be human for both and the particular shape humanity takes in men and in women. What's the alternative? Well, there's an image I return to from Lewis Hyde's work on a book called The Gift, a book about art and debt and gift economies and artist communities, and the very wide range of things Lewis Hyde always manages to pack into a book. And he manages to kind of slip into this book that's mostly recommended to people who are artists, a discussion of the theology of usury, which doesn't sound like a problem for artists exactly, except insofar as I suppose they're very vulnerable to usury because they're making very little money and have to decide how best to borrow or manage their debt. But he brings it up because he thinks the church's ban on usury originally spoke to a particular concern of what it meant to be human. He quotes early church fathers as saying the problem with usury, the problem with lending at interest, is that for things naturally should move from those who have them, from those who are comfortable, to those who are in need. He talks about it as being a law like gravity, the way gravity moves water. Our compassion for each other should move what we hold to the person who needs it. And what the church father he quotes is saying is, no one should be able to make a living by standing in the stream of need and diverting a rivulet of it to himself. And that, again, is, I feel, what's at the heart of what's denied us when we're presented a false image of gender and sexuality. We're not just denied something for women, even though very often when we expect everyone to come up to one model, when we try and say gender doesn't matter, we don't need to make room for it, we just need to help everyone be the same. It's women who are hurt most deeply and first. But it's not just a problem for women, because the very differences between men and women are part of what create those streams of need and dependence, the different ways we fit together. And when we dam them up, when we ask people to refuse to acknowledge them, to refuse to acknowledge the particular things we need, the particular ways the world is not formed for us, or the dependency that's in each of us that will never be fully solved by economic reforms or better tools, that will never each of us stand on our own. That's not the end state we're aiming for. We isolate each other in kind of stagnant ponds, unable to be fully ourselves because our needs are not known to each other, ourselves are not known to each other. And when women don't have the space to be women in our economy, in society, in even the stories we tell, men don't have the space to be men either. We know each other partly by how each of our weaknesses are answered by each other's strengths. And the more that we can kind of pull back those barriers, tell the full truth about what it means to be men and what it means to be women, the more easily those rivers of need and the answers to need can flow between us. And the better we know each other, the more room we have to acknowledge our differences, the more prepared we are as men and women to love, serve, and fully know each other. Thank you.